thinking. It's thinking. Maybe we'll get it going. While we're getting that going, why don't you go ahead and open up your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. In just a minute, we're going to read a couple of verses from there, and we got it up there. All right. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you so much for your hospitality this week. I have thoroughly enjoyed visiting with everybody, catching up with old friends, making new friends. It's just been a really encouraging week, and I've been sharing that with Anna every chance I get. When I get in the car, I try to touch base with her. Doesn't always happen, but that's what we try to do. She wishes she could be here, and we'll just have to work it out to bring her up here and the kids so you can meet the younger three especially. We only have 2 nights left. So let's do what we can for tonight and make the most of the next couple of nights. Really looking forward to Friday and talking about the victory of faith. We have all these other things that we're talking about, building up to the victory of our faith. And I don't know how you just can't get excited about that. So Lord willing, Friday night, that's what we'll be looking at. We're going to look at some of the same verses tonight that we did last night, but with a little different focus. So we're in Hebrews 11, and we started in verse 17 last night. And we were talking on down through about passing our faith on to the next generation. And so we were looking at the multi-generational aspect of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and how those fathers were successfully able to communicate their faith to their sons, and their sons made the choice to believe after them. Because all of our kids have to make a choice. They're not little robots. We don't get to program them. They have free will. And so we talked about that last night, but I want to look at a different aspect this evening by starting in verse 20, and we'll read 20, 21, and 22. Okay, so starting in verse 20, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Sounds a little morbid. There's something that all three of those men have in common. And what the author is focusing on here in these 3 verses is the faith that these men demonstrated in the twilight of their lives, just before they die. So when you go back and read the verses, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. He does that at the end of Genesis before his death. Right? And then you go to Jacob, when dying, blesses each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship. Verse 22, by Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus, the Israelites, and gave directions concerning his bones. These men, even though their earthly lives were coming to an end, by faith anticipated and saw something, and because of their faith in that future, that forward-looking aspect, they each did something by faith. And so I want us to think a little bit about each of those men and how their faith developed to that point, and then what they each specifically did. But before I do that, I want to walk through the idea of the following statement, and that is the wrong clicker. I want to think about this statement. Faith lives in the tension between promise and fulfillment. We engage the responsibilities of the present while anticipating the blessings of the future. That first sentence, faith lives in the tension between promise and fulfillment. That word tension is an interesting word. Sometimes we think about tension and it's a very negative thing. You know, you've got a tension headache. Things have gotten tense. And that's just one way that the word is used. Tension is also a positive thing. You think about water and the idea of surface tension. There's enough surface tension that something that is lightweight enough or is able to disperse its weight well enough is able to stay on the surface because of the tension between those molecules. The word tension comes from a Latin word that just means to stretch. So you think about tendons in our bodies that stretch between bones and muscles, allowing enough tension for you to bear weight and move. And I think that's the idea, that there's an appropriate amount of tension in our lives that's good. It stretches us. And what's going on is this. I live in the here and now. I live in the circumstances that I live in, and I'm trying to make sense of the world that I'm in right now. But God has made promises to me that are beyond the right now. I can't see them. I don't know all the details of that future, but I believe it, but I live right here. And so I'm pulled, I'm stretched between the here and now and what God has promised. Does that make sense? And so it might look a little something like this, where you're pulled and you're stretched, and you think about the present and what you can see and what you can know. And in the present is when God makes the promises, and all you are able to do is by faith to live up to the responsibilities of the present. But at the other end of this tension is the future, which is unknown by you and unseen by you. That at some point, God is going to fulfill his promises, and when he does, there is rest and joy. And what bridges the gap between that? What helps us endure the tension between those two things? And I think what we've been studying this week is faith. Faith is what bridges and helps us endure the tension and the stretching of the present with the future. We're not going to look at Abraham in detail tonight, but think about Abraham. Abraham had to live in that tension where God made promises to him at 75 years old, and some of those promises didn't get fulfilled for 25 years. And so for 25 years, 2.5 decades, he's living in the tension and the apprehension and the anticipation of the fulfillment, but it hasn't been fulfilled yet. And we do too. There are promises that God has made to us that we're waiting for. So we're going to come back to this chart at the end of the lesson and try to make application. But I want you to think about faith that way. And then let's look at these three men again, each in turn. Hebrews 11:20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. He's at the end of his life, and he invokes future blessings. He's thinking about what's going to happen after he's dead, after he's gone, and he's thinking about those boys, and that's what he does. How is he able to do that? We've already made the point that faith is what helps with that tension, but think about Isaac and how his faith must have developed. I'm going to reference several chapters in Genesis tonight. We're not going to read the whole stories because we just don't have time for that. But if you were to go back to Genesis chapter 22, you would read about the event when his dad took him up on a mountain to sacrifice him. He didn't fully know when Abraham started that journey away from the house that day what was going to go on. He thought it was going to be an animal sacrifice. I'm pretty sure he didn't know until he got up there and his dad started tying him up. That was probably a strong indicator. That's not normal. But he would have been there and he would have been coherent as Abraham raised the knife. And I wonder what he heard when God stopped him. But the knife never came down. The next thing he knows, he's being untied, and there's a ram that's been caught. And Abraham names the place the Lord will provide because God provided a substitute for his son. Right? And in that moment, he learns something about his dad. Not that he's psychotic, but that his dad had a lot of faith, because that incident is actually used in Hebrews 11. Because Abraham has got to explain to his son what just happened. He needs to explain to his son, I am sure that Isaac understood and heard and probably cherished the story of his birth. How long they had been waiting for him. How long and how impatiently. And finally, when all hope was gone, God fulfills his promise. He would have known that. And so he would have grown up in a household where faith was saturating everything, although he still had to choose it for himself. Later on, he has his own interesting interaction with God at the birth of his sons. Later on in Genesis chapter 25, God explains to Rebekah that there are twins, and they're wrestling with each other, and the younger is going to supplant the older, and it happens at birth. It happens at birth. And in that moment, God made a promise before the birth, and then they witnessed the birth, and then those boys lived up to that through the rest of their lives. And Isaac would have been like, God was right, and God kept his word. Like, that's what was going to happen. And so all through his life, God has been demonstrating that he's faithful to his word and he keeps his promises. So at the very end of his life, he has such great faith that he makes a promise. He gives a blessing to others. Let's put that up there. Genesis 27:29. What he says is, let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. May your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you. Blessed be everyone who blesses you. He's actually invoking and passing on sections of Abraham's blessings. Little pieces of Abraham's blessings are being passed down. And I think the point that we'll make is this, that Isaac's forward-looking faith led him to bless others. And we're going to make application of this at the end. But Isaac's forward-looking faith led to him blessing others. Let's look at the second example, Hebrews 11:21. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. I love that phrase at the end. And it's that phrase that we're going to focus on. Because he did the same thing as Isaac. He's passing on a blessing, but the detail here is that as he's doing that, he reverently bows over the top of his staff and he's worshiping God at the end of his life. And let's just talk about Jacob for a second. Again, I'm going to reference several chapters in Genesis. We're going to slow down with Joseph here in a minute. But with Jacob, his life was a roller coaster. It was a roller coaster of stubborn individualism and self-reliance. It just was. Like during the birth, they were wrestling and fighting, right? And there are examples of this in Genesis chapter 25. In Genesis 25, he takes advantage of his impulsive brother and takes his birthright. His brother comes in from hunting. He was not starving. He was not. He was like our 6-year-olds when they're like, I'm starving to death. You're like, you ate 30 minutes ago. I know. Right? That was Esau. Hairy dude rolls in, man, it's been so hot today. I would kill for whatever. And Jacob's like, oh, really? I've got a little, something here that would take care of that for you. All it's going to cost you is the great low price of your birthright. Esau's like, done. And what we know from later on in Hebrews is that Esau regretted that decision, and he cried over that decision, but he couldn't undo it. And the point is, there are some decisions that we make that have permanent consequences, and we can't undo them. But coming back to Jacob, what a jerk. What a jerk to take advantage of your brother, knowing his weaknesses, knowing his impulsiveness, and you take his birthright? Good grief. Not only that, you get to chapter 27. His dad is dying. His dad is about to die. And it's not enough that he's got his older brother's birthright. He wants the oldest brother's blessing. And when his mom comes to him and says, hey, we can sneak the blessing, he doesn't say, that is just such an immoral thing to do, mother. How could you ever suggest such a thing? That's not what he says. He's like, we can't get away with it. We shouldn't do it because we can't get away with it. She's like, trust me. And he goes along with deceiving his blind, dying father into stealing his brother's blessing. Horrible family dynamics here. Horrible. Even that his mother would suggest such a thing is horrible. And the fact that his father was enough with it to go, something's not quite right here. Like there's enough family dynamic stuff going on that he's suspicious. But he ends up going ahead anyway. And what I'm trying to point out here is this man at this point in his life is not relying on God, because God has already said what is going to happen. He's trying to make things happen on his own. His trust is in himself and in his cunning and in his deceit. He's not trusting in God. And only when his brother wants to kill him for what he's done does his mom save his life by telling him to run away. And in chapter 28, he finally learns to trust God. Because God makes a promise to him that he's going to take care of him, and he's going to bring him back, and he's going to give him the land. You know, when he has that vision at night of the angels ascending and descending, the ladder going up to heaven, and he's resting on the stone as a pillow, which is horrible, right? And what he does in that moment is Jacob says, God, if you will be faithful to your word, if you will keep your promises, you will be my God for forever. And God kept his promises. And so did Jacob. God demonstrated himself faithful to him directly, and he placed his faith in God. Now, he was not perfect from then on out. And actually, the attitudes that he had demonstrated toward his brother came back around on him, because that's how his father-in-law treated him. So he got a taste of his own medicine. He got cheated and gypped and all those kinds of things. Like going to be with your wife on your wedding night and waking up the next morning and going, wrong woman. Like, let's not even go there, but that happened. Thanks, father-in-law. But he got pranked, and he got duped, and he got taken advantage of. And if God had not been with him, keeping his promises, he would have had a rough life. And because God kept his promises, Jacob learned to trust in God. So that at the end of his life, it's that Jacob at the end of his life who's passing blessings on, and he is so humble and he is so in awe of God that he can't help but bow his head and worship before he dies. That's impressive. And so what I would suggest is this, is that Jacob's forward-looking faith led him to worship God. It led him to worship. Let's talk about Joseph. Hebrews 11 and 21. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. There's so much we could say about Joseph, so much we could say, because he foreshadows Christ in so many ways, right? God uses him to preserve life, which is what he does with Jesus. Like, there's so many things that we could say about Joseph. There are so many VBSs that use Joseph for good reason. They should. He takes up such a huge chunk of the history of Genesis. And it's through Joseph's life that you figure out why the Israelites were in Egypt and why they became in bondage for the Exodus. So he's an important figure in the history of Israel. But we're talking about his faith, and the faith that he displayed at the end by giving instructions about what would happen to his remains after he was gone. And what we've been saying so far this week is that faith is a response to God speaking. I believe the one, I trust the one who's doing the speaking, and by faith I respond appropriately to what he says. God makes his promises, and I respond to those promises. So let's just, for a second, go back and go to Genesis and go to chapter 37. And before we read it, think to yourselves, when did God make promises to Joseph? When did he do that? I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Genesis chapter 37. And I'm not going to be adamant about this. I'm just going to say this is my current think so, but it makes sense to me because of what we've been talking about, the nature of faith. In the first 11 verses of Genesis 37, we're introduced to Joseph more specifically. We've already been told about his family dynamics, the favoritism between all the wives, all of that stuff, the birth order, we've seen all of that, the naming that has significance, and oh goodness, the naming. Like they named those boys certain things in hostility against each other. So every time they said one of the kids' names, it was it was a passive-aggressive shot at the other wife. Like favoritism was going all through that house. And so you get to chapter 37, and what we're told, let's just start in verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. And this is where we struggle, because what we start to do is we start to impose our own motives and family dynamics and all kinds of stuff onto Joseph. I mean, if I were Joseph, this is what I would be doing. And if I were Joseph, of course I'd bring a bad report, that little tattletale, blah, 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 blah. The text does not say that. The text does not give you any revealed motive. So be really careful about ascribing motive to Joseph, because it is not there. What we're told is he was given a job, and he came home and told his dad that his brothers weren't doing their job. Which, if you were a boss, that's what you'd want your employee to do. Okay, now I'm not saying that there couldn't have been some, like, I got you guys. Maybe there was, we don't know. But what we do see is we see the favoritism. Again, favoritism. And because of the favoritism in verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him. It had nothing to do with Joseph's behavior. It had everything to do with their father's favoritism. Joseph wasn't in the wrong. Their dad was in the wrong. Like, his dad undermined healthy relationships between siblings. He put them at odds with each other. It says it was so bad they couldn't even speak peacefully to him. And then you get to verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream. And I think in these verses 5 through 11, the fact that he has a dream is super significant because it's repeated so many times. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream. Verse 6, hear this dream that I've dreamed. Verse 9, he dreamed another dream and said, behold, I've dreamed another dream. In verse 10, what is this dream that you've dreamed? For some reason, the author is trying to emphasize the dreams. There's something significant about the dreams. And this is the dream in verse 7. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Like, I'm not any kind of qualified analyst for dreams. That seems pretty straightforward. And the brothers got it right away. Are you telling us that we're going to bow to you? And this is where people, like, again, that's not a kid. Why do you have to tell them that? Think about the context of the Bible. When other people had dreams and they came from God, what were they supposed to do? It was a form of revelation, and they would communicate the dreams. So my own personal think so. There's no way that I can, I'm not going to die on this hill. But I think Joseph was like, God revealed something to me, and I need to tell you guys what I just dreamed. And then he had the same dream, just different imagery. But this time it included parents. And it was significant enough that his father, at the end, in verse 11, his father kept the saying in mind, or kept the saying in his heart. You know, that's the same response that Mary had to Jesus over in Luke chapter 2. And we're all like, Mary did such a good job. Because that was really significant. Same thing here. God is revealing something to Joseph, primarily for Joseph, but also to everybody else. These are the promises. This is why I say that. You start going through the rest of the text. You don't even have to leave the chapter. Joseph is one of the first recorded incidents of human trafficking, and that's not sugarcoating anything or exaggerating anything. He was a victim of human trafficking. His brothers kidnapped him with the intent to kill him. One of them was trying to keep them from killing him, and then they realized, hey, we can make a quick buck and get him out of our hair, so we're going to sell him into slavery, human trafficking, and he crosses borders. Messed up family dynamics. And then they try to cover it up like a murder, like an animal killed him, and bring this cloak home, and they are okay watching their dad mourn their brother who's not dead. As Joseph, how do you get over that? 17 years old. How do you get over that? Because God had made him a promise that had not been fulfilled yet. God gave him a promise that at some point in the future, his family would bow down to him. And it hadn't happened yet. And if God keeps his promises, what does that mean? Now, I'm sure he questioned on several different incidents in his life. Am I going to wake up tomorrow? Am I going to whatever? Like, I'll likely kill you in the morning. Like, you guys got that reference? Dread Private Roberts, different thing. What got him through those doubts? The fact that God had promised that something would happen, and it hadn't happened yet. So he would live to see another day because the promised day had not come. And then you can keep going forward through his life. You can look at Genesis 39, where he's in the household of Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife is making advances. And he stands up for his purity. And then she slanders him. And then he's falsely accused. He's arrested. He's imprisoned. What got him through that? Promise still hasn't been fulfilled yet. I'm going to be okay. Doesn't mean that right now is easy. It's the opposite of easy. But he went through it going, God's not done. God's not done. And then you get to chapter 40, and he's in prison. He's been elevated and promoted. But then this guy that he helps with dreams forgets about him. He helps him out, and he gets released, and he gets abandoned in prison. Until a while later, when it's convenient, the guy's like, oh yeah, hey, Pharaoh, I know this guy. Met him in the joint. Just now remembered. Sorry. But he might be able to help you with that. What got him through that betrayal? Promise still hasn't been fulfilled. It still hasn't been fulfilled. And then when you get to chapter 42, turn over to 42. There's this incredibly widespread famine, and his brothers go down to Egypt looking for grain because by Joseph's help, Egypt has been stockpiling grain. Verse 6, now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. The day came, and the promise was fulfilled. And I think the text is emphasizing that language for a very specific reason, because that's the language that was used in the dreams. The dreams were a promise, and God just kept it. He just kept it. And so by the time you see that happen, he has been working on his faith and helping him with his faith, helping him live a life of faith. So at the end of their father's life, when their father finally dies, and the boys are like, maybe Joseph's just as corrupt as us. Now that dad's out of the way, he's going to get us. So they go to him in Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. I don't think he did. I don't think he did. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. So they connect everything with God. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Joseph weeps several times through the course of this. And we need to think through, so why did he weep? I think for several reasons. You know how Joseph foreshadows Jesus? You remember the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept? I think we misunderstand why Jesus wept. I know that Jesus loved Lazarus. I get that. And the people that were watching him were the ones who reached the conclusion without asking Jesus, oh, he's weeping for Lazarus because he loved him. Jesus never said that. When you look at the context of that chapter in John, the people that are relationally closest to Jesus are questioning whether he had the power to do anything. The ones who should have known him the most intimately, known him the best. And they're questioning whether Jesus could have done anything. And so when Jesus weeps, when he gets to the tomb, and he's got these sisters that are both questioning, Jesus, why weren't you here? Why couldn't you? And all the people are like, yeah, why couldn't you? And he's like, do you not get who I am? And he weeps because he is so misunderstood and not recognized by the people who should see him for what he is. Joseph foreshadowed that. He's already forgiven them. He's already delivered them. He's already given them food. He's done with it. And they can't see Joseph for who he is. He's weeping for the same reason that Jesus was weeping. And then in verse 18, his brothers also came and fell down before him. They bow again. Behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are this day. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them. So the guy, he was the victim of trafficking by these guys, right? And he's the one providing comfort after the death of his dad, because he's so much like Jesus. And there's a powerful word there in verse 20. It's the word meant. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And that word meant in other places is used to describe the idea of weaving something. And I don't know if you've ever seen people work a loom. They do not walk into a room and grab a bunch of yarn and throw the thing at it and walk out, and miraculously a beautiful piece of fabric comes out with all its patterns and designs. It's not the way it works. Someone sits down and they're like, I like this color and this color and this color, and I'm going to achieve this pattern, and I'm going to pass it through at these intervals. So like they've already got the completed project in their mind when they start. And they weave something beautiful together. Tapestries, rugs, clothing. That's what they do. And Joseph is saying, you guys were weaving this thing. You were weaving this horrible, hostile thing for me. But God actually used you all to weave this thing, which was good. Now, did he know that when he was 17? No. But his faith was refined through the course of his life so that at this point, he's able to look back and go, guys, I can see God all along the way. We don't always see him in the moment, but you can look back and see him along the way because he keeps his promises all the way along. And he's weaving a bigger picture than you can even see. And so we see all of that. We see all of that with Joseph. We saw the promises and the years of tension. We saw the fulfillment of those promises. And because of his personal experience, experiencing the faithfulness of God regarding his earlier life, Joseph believed God would keep his promise of giving them Canaan. If God fulfilled all of this in my life, then the promise that God is going to give us the land of Canaan, he's going to do that too. And so as he is dying, he's like, guys, at some point, I don't know when and I don't know how, God is going to lift us up out of Egypt and he's going to take us back to the promised land. And I'm so confident of that I want you to keep track of my bones. And when that day comes, get me out of here. Like, that's some impressive faith. That's some really impressive faith. So Joseph's forward-looking faith led to making instructions and provisions for the future. Let's make some application here. Let's make some application. And I know we've been like covering wide swaths of Bible, but I think there's value in that. Let's go back to our chart. And the statement that faith lives in the tension between promise and fulfillment, that was Joseph. All of those years living between the promise at age 17 and decades later when his brothers finally show up and fulfill it. And he has so much hardship in between, but he always has those dreams from his childhood stuck in his head. God said this would happen. God said this would happen. God said this would happen. But he had to live in the middle waiting. And that's what faith does. In the meantime, what he went about was engaging the responsibilities of the life as he had it. When he was with Potiphar, I'm going to do this job. I don't know how long I'm going to have this job, but I'm going to do this job to the glory of God as long as I've got it. And then he's imprisoned. Well, wasn't anticipating this job, but I'm going to do this job for as long as I've got it. And he did it well. And then he gets promoted. I'm going to do this job to the best of my ability for as long as I've got it. And in that job is when God kept the promise. Right? So on one hand, we have the present with what's known and seen, where God makes the promises and I have responsibilities, and the tension while I wait for the future and for God to reveal his plan, what God knows and what God sees. And I just have to trust that God knows and he sees. God's all-knowing. He knows what's coming, and he knows what he's weaving. So as we look at those three guys, what we're saying is that there's a season of life in between the promise and the fulfillment. There's this season of tension in the middle, and these three men give us some examples of what to do in that season. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think Hebrews 11, 20, 21, and 22 give us some suggestions about what we can do during that season. The first is this: I want to bless others. That's the first thing that we saw with Jacob, is that he pronounced blessings before he died. By faith, he pronounced blessings. By faith, I want to bless others by pointing them to a future where God is at work. My uncle passed away last year at 59 by cardiac arrest, so young. When I graduated high school, he bought me this really cheesy looking t-shirt. Bright yellow and gaudy colors, like it was so 90s. I love what it said on it, though. It was one of those cheesy graduation things. I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. God's name isn't even on the shirt. But what my uncle was trying to pass along is, look, Jeremy, I don't know what you're going to do after 1996. I don't know what 1997 is going to hold. I don't know what 2000 is going to hold. I don't know. I just don't know. And neither do you. But God does. God knows. He knows what he's going to do, and he knows what he's trying to accomplish. And so if I believe that, I want to do what my uncle did for me. Look, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in 2023 up here. I don't know. But God does. So keep coming back to God. Put your trust in God. In the meantime, live out the responsibilities that you've got while you wait to see what God has in store for the future. All you can do is what you can do. But trust God. Right? By faith, we want to bless others by pointing them to a future where God is at work. Because God doesn't stop working, even though we can't see it. Think about the second example that we had of how to live in the tension between promise and fulfillment. Gratefully remember God's faithfulness in your past and worship him. You don't have to know what God's going to do in the future, but you can look past in your own past and go, I can see that God was working there. And boy, did God really step in there. And God answered this prayer. And if that's true, praise God. I mean, we can use the Exodus. We can use the Exodus for this. Things are horrible in chapter 1. Baby boys are being killed as population control. Horrible. And the burdens are oppressive, and the people are crying out, and God waits for Moses to hit 80 years old, but until he's ready. He's finally humble enough to be useful, and then God sends him back in, and God uses Moses and Aaron to lead the people out after 10 really dramatic plagues. And he delivers them through this miraculously parted sea, and when they get on the other side, as the waves are slowly churning, do you know what they do? They break out into song. They worship. Because worship is a response to the faithfulness of God. Worship is a response to the faithfulness of God. It's so appropriate to have Bible readings during our worship services at intervals to help us give reason for the praise we're offering. That's appropriate. You know, sometimes we try to work ourselves up to worship before we even remember the wondrous deeds of God. Maybe it's easier to have the attitude that we ought to have when we're reminded of what God has done. Right? So gratefully remember God's faithfulness in your past and worship him. And then with Joseph, he gave those instructions by faith. We want to make life decisions believing that God keeps his promises. And then we want to communicate those decisions to others. We all face really big life choices. We don't always know what the outcomes are going to be. But we make those choices by faith, knowing that God is going to act, that he's going to respond. We don't always know how, we don't always know when, but we know he will. Some things we do have details. Jesus is going to come back, and we're told all these powerful ways that that's going to happen, and some of the details, we don't know when. That's where the faith comes in, but we know it's going to. How about communicating that to our young people as they're making decisions, where their focus isn't on way down the road, their focus is on like right here. You remember being 20? You can see like 3 months in front of your face. That is it. I need a job right now, and I need to be married right now, and I need to do all this stuff right now, and I need to right now. It's like at some point, you're not even going to be here. Like your life is not about this life, and that's hard to see when you're 20. Your life is about after this life, and the things that you choose to do while you're here affect it. So make wiser choices in those little 3-month segments. Try to get more of an eternal perspective. And that's going to look so different to people who can't see past 3 months. When you start making decisions for heaven as a young person and other people aren't, you're going to stand out. And some are going to get it and some aren't going to get it. But make life decisions believing that God keeps his promises and communicate them. Communicate them to people. Let them know what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. It's an evangelistic tool. It even provides accountability. Because we get distracted from our commitments. And if we've communicated them to people, they can come back to us and be like, hey, do you remember when you said you weren't going to do this, but you were going to do this? No, I don't remember that. I do. Okay? Communicate those decisions to others. Help them see heaven. Help them see heaven. We've taken 2 sermons from the same couple of verses the last couple of nights. Did you know you can do that? I hope it was helpful. It was really helpful to me the first time someone pointed out this idea of tension. Right? That was just so helpful. Let's go ahead and switch this back over. I want to go back to the idea of Joseph for just a second while we pull that up. I loved when someone pointed out the idea of meant and woven. Because when we read the word meant, what we tend to think is, well, God had this goal, this nebulous goal, and eventually it kind of got around to that. But when you understand that the idea is he wove, he was actively working. There weren't any accidents along the way. We think they're accidents, we think they're speed bumps, but God's accounted for all of those. God in his power has even accounted for your free will. He's accounted for other people sinning along the way. That he has an incredible tapestry that includes your life. And Joseph is such a powerful figure because he submitted to God and chose faith. God's going to use you for his great purposes, whether you choose to submit or not. But it's going to be so much better for you if you choose to submit. And if you choose faith. It's going to be better for you. God's going to be glorified either way. And at the end, every knee's going to bow, whether you choose to or not. You're going to bow. But it's going to be so much better for you if you choose to bow. Right? So, if you're not yet a Christian, we'd like to encourage you to choose faith in Christ and be baptized into his body tonight. Or maybe you are a Christian, but you've been struggling in your faith. You've been struggling with successfully living in the tension between now and the fulfillment of the promises. That's normal. It is normal to struggle. And if you are, we'd like to encourage you along the way. We'd like to pray for you along the way and try to answer whatever questions that you've got the best that we can. I know the elders would love to do that. I know Bill would love to do that.